"That can't be him," Verena Cross said, right there on the Cedar Hollow platform. And the moment he stepped off that stage, her whole careful life changed forever, though it would take her the rest of this story to admit it out loud again. Stay with me clear through to the end, because what happened after that sentence left her mouth is worth every minute of it, and I promise you the whole thing, start to finish, porch and all. The letter had taken Verena 3 weeks to write, and not because the words gave her trouble. She had run her own ledgers since she was 22, negotiated cattle prices with buyers who assumed a woman alone could be talked down, and signed her own deed with a hand that never shook in front of a stranger. Words on paper were easy. It was the truth behind them that kept catching in her throat. Every night she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low, wrote a line, and crossed it out because it sounded like a woman still grieving, and she had promised herself 3 years ago that grieving was done being visible. "I run 400 head on good grass in the Wind River country. Too plain, I am a widow of independent means seeking a practical arrangement. Too cold, and worse, it was a lie dressed as honesty, because nothing about what she wanted was practical at all. What she wanted, if she let herself name it, was a man she would never once be tempted to love, because loving a second time was a door she had already nailed shut with her own 2 hands. In the end, the letter she sent through the agency in Cheyenne ran 9 sentences. She told them her acreage, her cattle count, the good water on her land, and the hard winters that came with it. She told them she needed a husband who was capable and undemanding, who understood a ranch came first, and who wasn't chasing an easy life, because Cedar Hollow had never once offered anybody an easy life. And at the bottom, the line she told herself was purely practical. "Do not send a likeness. I have no wish to make this sentimental." She mailed it on a Tuesday, and by Thursday had half convinced herself to ride into town and take it back. It was Amos Teague, who had ranched beside her family longer than Verena had been alive, and had buried his own wife 2 winters before Verena buried her husband, who talked her out of unsending it. He found her on the porch steps one evening, with her boots off and her eyes on the middle distance, and he sat down uninvited the way old friends do. "You're going to work yourself into the ground out here, Verena, not from the cattle, from the quiet." She hadn't answered. "A woman isn't built to carry 400 acres alone forever," he pressed. "I'm not talking about hired hands. I'm talking about somebody across the table. I had that once. I know you did. Daniel's been gone 3 years. 3 years and 4 months, came the quiet correction, and Amos looked at her the long way old friends look at each other, when they both know the difference isn't really about counting. She didn't write the letter for another 2 months after that conversation, but she wrote it, and there was a line from Annie Oakley that Verena kept turning over while she worked up the courage, about aiming at a high mark, because low aim was the real sin, and Verena decided if she was going to do this reckless thing at all, she would at least do it with her eyes open, instead of aiming low and calling it safe. The stage from Rock Springs came through Cedar Hollow every Tuesday and Friday, and on the Friday in question, Verena arrived at the depot 40 minutes early, which she told herself was on account of a feed order she had to collect, and had nothing whatsoever to do with nerves. She wasn't nervous. She had made a sound business decision and intended to handle it the way she handled everything, which was plainly, with her hat pulled low and her arms crossed and her face arranged into the expression most of Cedar Hollow recognized as Verena Cross's version of civil. Word had gotten around the way it always did, in a town of 200 and change with 1 telegraph line. Peg Hallison from the boarding house was there because she had a room already made up. Otis Pruitt was there for no honest reason at all, except that he liked to watch things happen before anyone else got to hear about them secondhand. Verena ignored the lot of them, looked down the road for the dust of the stage, and told herself firmly that it did not matter one bit what kind of man climbed down off that coach, because this was a contract and not a romance, and she was 29 years old, and had already loved a man once, and buried him, and knew exactly the price of doing that twice. She was still telling herself that when the coach rattled up Main Street trailing summer dust, and the horses stamped to a blowing stop, and the platform filled with the ordinary business of arrival, an older couple stepped down first, unremarkable, sorted quickly into the crowd. Verena was watching the driver wrestle down a trunk far too large for anyone's definition of practical, When the platform went quiet in that particular way, a crowd goes quiet without meaning to, all its attention swinging toward one point at once. She looked up. He was standing on the coach step with one hand braced on the doorframe, reading the platform the way a man reads weather, not timid, not lost, taking careful inventory of the town he might be about to live in. He wore a plain traveling coat gone pale with road dust, dark hair a little too long for fashion, and he carried his own single case rather than waiting for anyone to hand it down. He was nothing like what she had pictured. She hadn't known exactly what she had pictured, only that it was smaller somehow, softer, a man who would look at her with the particular grateful desperation she had told herself she was buying security for. This man wasn't looking at anyone with gratitude. He stepped down with the easy balance of someone who had crossed rough country before, set his case on the platform, and looked around at Cedar Hollow the way a person takes stock of a place they are deciding whether they can live in. And Verena Cross, who had not been rattled by another human being standing still since the worst winter of her life, heard her own voice before she gave it permission. That can't be him. Otis Pruitt, standing 2 feet to her left, heard it plainly and bit down on a grin, which was the closest thing to discretion Otis Pruitt had managed in a decade. The stranger's eyes moved across the platform and found her, and whatever speech Verena had rehearsed for this exact moment walked clean out of her head and did not return. Rourke Bellamy, formerly of Independence, Missouri. The name came out plain, the way a man states a fact he owes no one an apology for. Verena Cross, she returned, though from the way he was looking at her, she suspected he already knew. The wagon's on 2nd Street. If you've got more baggage than the one case, just the trunk, I can manage it myself. I didn't say you couldn't. Something crossed his face, reading something in hers, and he didn't look away first, which she noticed and filed away without examining too closely. I expect you spent the ride over talking yourself into being reasonable about all this. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. I did the same thing for 2 days on that coach, picking up his case. Told myself not to expect anything. Only I couldn't work out what it was I was supposed to expect, so I stopped trying. I'm here, you're here. We're both sensible people. The rest we can work out as it comes. It was, she would think later, the most unsettling thing a stranger had ever put to her plainly, because it was entirely reasonable, delivered with a steadiness that wasn't coldness, and wasn't distance but something she couldn't yet name. The agreement, arranged through the agency, was 1 week in town before anything was decided, Rourke staying at Peg Hallison's boarding house, so both of them could back out clean if the arrangement didn't take. Rourke lasted 4 hours there before he came looking for a wagon headed toward the Cross Ranch. Peg told him it was 6 miles north, with nobody driving that direction until evening, and Rourke said evening suited him fine. He'd walk if he had to. He didn't have to. Amos Teague's boy Dell was hauling feed that way, and took some convincing before he agreed to carry a stranger with a trunk out past the Cross place. But agreed he did, and by the time Verena heard the wagon in her yard, she had already half decided it was Dell alone with a feed order, until she stepped out of the barn wiping her hands on a rag and saw the two of them on the bench seat and stopped walking entirely. The arrangement was a week in town. I know what the arrangement was. Then why are you here? Because I'm not deciding whether to spend my life somewhere I haven't seen the inside of. He was already climbing down to make the point plain. Are you? She opened her mouth. She closed it again. Dell suddenly found the feed bags fascinating. It needs work, she managed finally, meaning the house. I assumed as much. There's a spare room past the kitchen. Small. I don't need large. And he picked up his trunk before she could argue about who was carrying it, and walked beside her, rather than behind her toward the house, which she noticed and did not comment on. The house was exactly what she'd told him, functional and bare, built by a woman who had stopped decorating for anyone's benefit, including her own. Rourke didn't remark on the curtainless windows or the absence of anything that could be called comfort. He walked the kitchen first, opened the cold larder, checked the flue on the stove, and by dinner he had found the flour bin nearly empty and 2 tins gone soft on top that needed throwing out before somebody got sick, and he'd said so plainly, the way a man reports facts rather than criticism. Verena hadn't asked him to cook, and yet he was at the stove with his sleeves rolled when she came in from the corral, and there were potatoes frying and something that smelled like dried sage she hadn't touched in 2 years. Neither of them talked much through dinner. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, more like two people measuring the distance between themselves and deciding privately whether it was workable. He washed, she dried, because standing there watching him seemed rude, and afterward he said goodnight and went to the small room off the kitchen, and Verena stood a long while in the quiet afterward, unsettled by the fact that the house felt different. Not better exactly, different, the way a room feels once a window's been opened somewhere out of sight. The week passed faster than a week alone ever had, which was its own kind of surprise, because Verena had learned the hard way in the year after Daniel and Jonah that solitude stretched time thin as wire. Rourke didn't fill silences for the sake of filling them, didn't perform cheerfulness, but he worked alongside her, and working alongside someone changed the shape of a day entirely. He was up before her most mornings, which she discovered the first Tuesday when she came into the kitchen at first light and found the fire already lit, and Rourke at the table with a pencil stub, going through the ranch's account book she hadn't asked him to touch. "You went through my ledgers." Not looking up from the page, he pointed out that somebody should know what's owed and what's coming due before winter. "I've kept those books 15 years. I know. That's why I only checked the arithmetic." She sat down across from him with her coffee, half annoyed and half something she wasn't ready to call relief, and found that his additions were correct, and that he'd noticed a supplier overcharging her on salt for 2 seasons running without her catching it once. He wasn't a rancher, and he never pretended to be one, deferring to her plainly on cattle and grass and the reading of weather the way she deferred to nobody on those matters. But he had a different kind of usefulness that surprised her more than competence with cattle would have. He'd traveled as a boy with his father across rural Missouri, he mentioned one evening on the porch, a man who'd started as a country doctor and ended up doing half the legal paperwork for families too poor or too far from town to hire a real attorney, deeds and wills and the untangling of boundary disputes between neighbors who couldn't afford to fight properly. "I learned to read a contract the way some men read scripture, front to back, looking for what's been left out. What happened to him? He died when I was 23. I was married briefly after. 3 years. My wife Naomi took a fever the second winter, and there wasn't a doctor within 30 miles who could do anything my father hadn't already taught me not to expect." Verena hadn't thought to ask about his history before that evening, too occupied with guarding her own, and something in her rearranged itself slightly at the realization that he had one too, and that it was every bit as heavy as hers. Late in that first week, Verena found him in the back room, the one she had told him plainly needed nothing done to it, the door pulled shut on purpose for 3 years. He had the window open, and his hand pressed flat against the water-damaged wall beneath it, a candle in his other hand, checking how far the rot had spread, when he heard her stop in the doorway and turned, and understood immediately from her face that something was wrong. "I'm sorry, it came out quiet. I should have asked before I came in here." "You said the back room needed looking at," she managed. "That's not the same as asking," and he set the candle down and waited, which was the exact right thing to do, because Verena found herself telling him, in a voice she kept flat through 15 years of practice at keeping it flat, that this had been Jonah's room, that her son had been 4 years old, that he and Daniel had been crossing the Larkspur Creek Bridge on a Friday in October when the rotted boards gave way beneath the wagon, and that she had closed this door in the week after and had not opened it again until Rourke walked through it, without knowing what he was standing inside of. He didn't offer comfort she hadn't asked for. He simply held the candle and stayed still, and when she finished, only this: "I'll fix the wall for you, if you want it, and then it can be whatever you decide to make it. It doesn't need to be anything else right now." And she found, standing there with the door open for the first time in 3 years, that she was grateful for that, in a way that sat too deep for easy words. Trouble arrived the next week in the shape of a man named Dorian Crane, who had come into the territory 18 months before with money nobody could account for, and bought the largest building on Cedar Hollow's Main Street to run as a land office of his own invention. Verena rode the north boundary that Monday and found 4 fresh stakes driven into the ground, orange ribbon tied at the top of each, planted 15 yards inside her own line under cover of dark. She pulled everyone out of the ground and rode back to the house hard enough that Rourke was off the porch and moving before she'd tied off her horse. He staked my north boundary. How many stakes? 4. 15 yards inside my line. Did you pull them? Every one. That might complicate things, but I wasn't going to leave a stranger's stakes on my own land. And Rourke's answer came plain. He wouldn't have left them either, and led her inside to write down everything they knew before either of them decided what to do next. At the kitchen table, Rourke laid it out with a clarity that startled her. Not because she doubted him, but because she hadn't expected the arrangement she'd written for in a 9-sentence letter to come with a man who could read a boundary dispute the way she read a sky before hail. The stakes weren't a legal action. They were bait, meant to provoke her into a confrontation his lawyer could use against her later. The real move would come at the county seat within the week. A formal claim that the old boundary settlement had never been properly filed, citing a survey his own man had already walked. Was it filed? I believe so, though the commissioner who handled it died 6 years back, and I couldn't swear the paper's still sitting in Cheyenne. Then that's the hole he's counting on, and something in Rourke's face sharpened in a way she hadn't seen yet. The look of a man recognizing a shape he'd watched his father fight before. I've seen this exact scheme run before. Not this county, but the shape's the same. A man doesn't stake a boundary he's unsure of. He stakes one he already knows the answer to, and is betting the record can't prove it. They rode together to the Doyle place that afternoon. An older ranching family 2 miles east, who'd fought Crane over their own water rights the year before, and settled for less than they were owed just to end it. And old man Doyle, missing 2 fingers to a thresher, and philosophical about it, told them everything he remembered, and allowed, when they finished, that Rourke had married a smart one, an assessment Rourke didn't dispute, which made Verena feel something warm and unfamiliar settle behind her ribs she didn't examine closely either. That night on the porch, Rourke laid out the rest of what he suspected, that Crane wasn't after her north pasture at all, but the water beneath it, that whoever controlled creek access in a valley this size effectively controlled every ranch downstream of it, and that he'd bet Crane had run this same quiet scheme on at least 3 other properties nobody had thought to compare notes on. If he was right, this stopped being one rancher's boundary trouble and became a pattern of fraud, and a documented pattern goes to the Territorial Land Commission, not a county judge who can be waited out. How do you know about land commissions? My father filed 2 such complaints in his time. I copied every page of both by hand. I know exactly what one needs to hold up. The formal filing came within the week exactly as Rourke had predicted, naming the river-adjacent North 40 as disputed, and asking for an injunction against Verena, using it while the matter dragged. That parcel held her best grazing and her only reliable water in a dry year, and losing it through the summer would gut her herd by winter. Rourke spent 4 days gathering testimony from families Crane had already ruined while Verena rode to the county seat herself to secure the original filings, because when he offered to make that 3-day ride in her place, she refused flatly. If Crane has men watching these roads, they're watching for the owner of record, not for me alone. I'm not sending you into that. I'll go. He argued for exactly as long as it took him to understand. Her mind was already made, and then, only this. I'll be here when you get back. And something in the plainness of it carried her the whole 3 days there and back better than any promise dressed up fancier would have. While Verena rode, Rourke worked Cedar Hollow itself. Peg Hallison, who had run the boarding house for 22 years and treated information as its own kind of currency, gave him 2 names within the hour. A sheep operation north of the Doyle place that had been sold off quietly 3 years before, no dispute, no public filing, the family simply gone, and a smaller parcel east of town where a widow named Odette Vance had sold her own water-adjacent section to a company that turned out, once Otis Pruitt looked into it out of pure curiosity, to share a registered agent with Crane's own attorney. Odette Vance was 71, sharp-eyed, and still furious about it, and what came out of her, once Rourke sat with her a while in her daughter's parlor, wasn't the story of a woman who'd sold willingly. It was a string of letters, each one polite, each one reasonable, each one making her feel the fault was hers for holding on, until a young attorney in a fine coat had come to see her once, in person, quietly hoping the matter could be settled without the unpleasantness of a public hearing, because public hearings had a way of raising questions difficult to put back to rest. 71 years old and alone, she'd sold. Would she set it all down on paper, exactly as it happened? It would help considerably. And Odette Vance straightened in her chair and asked for a pen before he'd finished the sentence. Verena's own ride was no easier. 3 days on a territorial road that had swallowed men before her, alone with a deed and a growing certainty that she was being watched somewhere past the tree line, though nothing ever showed itself plainly enough to name. She reached the county seat on the second evening, found the old boundary settlement still filed exactly where it should have been, paid a clerk to certify a copy, and rode the last stretch home faster than good sense recommended, because 3 days felt like a very long time to leave a promise like his unanswered. She returned with the original boundary filing, still on record after all, and with it, and Rourke's 4 days of gathered testimony spread across her kitchen table, they found what broke the case wide open. The same surveyor Crane had used in her dispute had sworn independence in an earlier case, 2 counties over, while drawing pay from Crane's company the same month. "That isn't a survey error," Rourke said, staring at the dates side by side. "That's conspiracy, and it's sitting in the official record of a case he thought was buried for good." The hearing before the Territorial Land Commission was held in Cheyenne on a bright, cold morning 5 weeks after Rourke first stepped off that stage, and the room was already half full when Verena walked in, wearing the green traveling dress she'd arrived in. Rourke beside her carrying the document case, Amos Teague and the Doyles, and an elderly widow named Odette Vance who Crane had quietly cheated out of her own water rights 2 years before, all seated behind the rail as witnesses. Crane sat across the aisle, composed and silver-haired in city clothes, and something crossed his face when Verena walked in that she recognized because she'd felt a version of it herself on the Cedar Hollow platform 5 weeks before. The look of a man recalculating and not finding many options left. Verena laid the case out herself, plainly, the way she'd have laid out a bad winter to her own hands. The boundary filing that had never been lost, the pattern across 4 properties, the surveyor sworn independent in one case while drawing Crane's pay in another. The room went very quiet when she set the 2 surveyors' oaths side by side on the commissioner's table. "That is not a surveying error," Verena told the panel plainly. "That is a man paid to say what Crane needed him to say, and a pattern this exact does not happen by accident 4 separate times." Crane's attorney had nothing that held up, and the lead commissioner, a man named Denby with a dry, exacting voice, put the question to Crane directly. Would he care to explain the dates? Crane did not. He withdrew the claim before the commission had finished its recess, and by spring he was occupied with troubles of his own making in Cheyenne, and never rode near Cedar Hollow again. The valley's other ranchers got their water rights confirmed clean within the year, and Cedar Hollow told the story for a long time afterward, the way small towns tell the stories that matter to them, about a woman who ordered a husband the way she'd order lumber, and got a man who helped her end a scheme that had been quietly bleeding the whole valley dry, about the platform and the stage, and the sentence everybody standing there had heard her say. That can't be him, and he was. He was exactly what she'd been too afraid to ask for outright, and he'd come anyway, and stayed. They married that autumn on the Cross Ranch. Amos Teague and Peg Hallison standing witness. Odette Vance and the Doyle family filling chairs against the porch rail. And in the year that followed, the back room's wall was fixed and, in time, became a room for a child again. The garden Rourke had never once pretended to know how to tend properly grew fine anyway because Verena tended it herself in the evenings, and the kitchen table stayed the table and never went back to being merely a surface. Amos Teague took to riding by at noon on Tuesdays and Fridays, more often than the coffee alone accounted for, and everyone understood that was not the whole reason and let him have it. On an evening the following fall, Verena sat on the porch steps in the dark the way she always had, boots off, eyes on the sky, and the door opened behind her, and Rourke came out and sat beside her, not below her on the steps, not across a table, beside her, and he had his coffee and she had hers, and the Wyoming sky held more stars than any sky had a right to. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing." And she meant it, not the nothing of a woman drowning in silence, but the nothing of somebody exactly where she was meant to be, needing to be nowhere else. Rourke leaned his shoulder against hers. She didn't move away. Verena Cross had come to that porch for 3 years, believing her aloneness was strength and her grief was permanent, and she had been wrong about both, because love, it turned out, hadn't been the thing that cost her everything. Love had been the thing that gave it back. And that, friends, is the whole of it, porch and all, exactly as I promised you at the start. If this one settled somewhere warm in your chest, you know where to find us for the next ride. This has been a story complete from first hoofbeat to last, the way we always tell them here at Cowgirl Chronicles. And if you want more like Verena and Rourke waiting for you, come sit by the fire again soon. I'll leave the gate open.